Good morning. Today I'm going to continue the lecture which we had earlier had about particularly monopoly, because in the previous lectures we had discussed about perfect competition and later on monopoly, and some of the important aspect of the monopoly is being left, and I'll be touching upon on that part in the beginning. It is also helps to rewind what we have talked about earlier. So the first point is actually about the peak load pricing. Peak load pricing, we know that this is also a part of the monopoly behavior of the firm. When demand is not evenly distributed, a firm needed to have facilitated to accommodate periods of high demand. So even with the large facilities, the firm may experience time when the demand is greater than can be handled. Then the firm may experience costly computer system crashes, etc. So during off-peak time period of lower demand, there is an excess capacity in that sense. So peak load pricing is actually something which talks about when there is a consumption surge is higher and you basically charge a higher price for it. So this is what is actually in a very simple sense or a lay language peak load pricing means. So the firm charges less at off peak price in that sense, on the contrary. So more phone calls are made during the business hours than the evening and on weekend. That's what many times in at this time often the offers are always given in weekends where the peak was not so high, but still in order to maintain the pace of the phone calls or use of internet or whatever, all kinds of this activity, normally the system is trying to offer you, or the network providers often try to give you a kind of offers during the weekends, and that is why you get more data, more calls, facilities. In the night time, you earlier used to have unlimited calls, etc., and now it is all time, it is unlimited and all, because of the change to 4G and 3G networks. And now during, I mean, expectedly in the 5G network which is going to come up, is again going to have a very technologically advanced kind of access to everyone. So in that sense, it's quite interesting to have always to look into the aspect of peak load pricing, where the rush hours always been charged very high in the industrial time, business time. All this that period is always being discriminatorily charged very high. This is what is actually, it is possible only under the monopoly kind of situation, which we haven't actually talked in the last lecture. Again, this is actually the kind of formula normally we can calculate with the aspect of peak load. We need to find where the MR and MC for delay, or for nights, for days, during the peak or the off peak, whatever. So we can actually compute all these things, and this is very preliminary. In the textbook which I referred is going to give you a clear one. So another point which again we need to really talk about is the monopoly with respect to the monopsony market condition in that sense. Because in monopoly, as we said, it is only one seller, whereas in the monopsony, possibly an opposite of monopoly is all is that is seller, single seller is being played, that is single buyer. So Monopsony in that sense very clearly says that only one buyer and there may be many sellers in that context. Okay, so whereas you have actually monopoly talks about probably many buyers, but not necessarily many sellers, only one seller in that context. So what would be the instance or the marginal curves, like marginal cost or marginal revenue in that context? So we already seen that the marginal cost and marginal revenue of the monopoly, where the marginal cost itself is basically going to follow the supply curve of the monopolist, because given that or she has no sort of competitor, and the production and the supply is solely being controlled by the monopolist. In this context, the buyer is going to also, the demand is completely being controlled by the seller, sorry, the buyer, because the seller may be in this market situation, that may not necessarily more only one seller, but there may be probably more seller present, or even if it is one seller exists, then the market condition would be somewhat different. We normally call it as bilateral monopoly, because the seller, a single seller and the single buyer plays in that context, where you can simply understand that the cost and the benefit curves which was given in as per the curve, which is quite a standard in that sense. So I don't want to actually spend much time, but however, given that I've talked about monopoly earlier, so I thought to just talk a little bit more on monopsony and monopoly. Again, in the real world situation, there are possibility of cartels. That is, we already know that there are many cartels, like the diamond cartel. Internationally, the diamond cartel exists, and of course, we do have oil cartel, which is what is actually determines the supply and the price of the commodity in that sense in the international market, which is called the OPEC, oil producing countries cooperation. So that is a kind of a cartel which in fact determines and in fact create a kind of monopoly. That means while we though you are actually distinct firms, what do? You come together and form as a monopoly in that sense. Internationally, the price and the quantity will be always been controlled by this cartel in that sense. This is actually precisely the case with the diamond, cartel or gold cartel, and there are so many international cartels they exist. This is actually called the open cartels, and of course there are tacit agreements between industries or firms also in the real world, which again creates a kind of monopoly in the real world situation. So this is, in fact, this is not completely the monopoly, which, as we said, because this is because of the coming together of different firms and making them a kind of a monopoly and control over the price. Then that kind of a situation can be also treated as cartel or kind of monopoly in that sense. Through cartel, the monopoly being formed. So in that context, there are many firms, as in the graphical presentation easily gives you a kind of layer. That is now many, at least two firms exist, that is A and B. So if A and B has two producer who produces the same said diamond, they been produced as the diamond producers, oil being made produced by the oil producing countries, in fact. So they come together and form it as a bundle, and they try to sell it in the international market. So in that sense, this is actually forms as we given in the picture, like the demand and the marginal revenue of them is actually you know determined based on some sort of a marginal cost principle, maybe the least cost, the highest cost incurring country's price maybe be put as the international price, and then the other countries in fact may be getting a kind of a super profit in that sense. So this the cost maintained price will be set because of this kind of situation. So this is what is actually a kind of cartel or the tacit agreement or all kinds of this business strategies in fact makes a kind of monopoly in the real world. So this is actually what we want to speak about, the monopoly in real world sense. Otherwise there is it is difficult to find a real world monopoly of this kind, a theoretical kind of thing, because of course it's possible because of seclusion, because of the natural monopoly. That is the final point which I have to talk about. That is, normally the government or kind of situation the natural situation in fact creates a kind of monopoly. For example, if there are no other person supplies certain commodity, say railway earlier in India or in Britain or in the United States, been provided by the government, and later that has been given away to the other sort of transportation in the economy. So naturally, the natural monopoly with us in that sense. So railway can be treated as, at least for the time being till India, you have a railway which is almost like act as a monopoly. Now the government is having plan to uh, disinvest or give the stations, the operations and other things to private individual. Then it is no longer going to be a kind of monopoly. But still, the operation wise only you can in fact this kind of firms treat it as a monopoly, or they try to give private enterprises to get profitable kind of business, or run it as like a competitive kind of business in that sense. Now, let me come to the third major market situation. Given that we have perfect competition, which is also ideal, then you have a monopoly, which is also ideal in terms of super profit. Whereas perfect competition, we talked about, there is no profit. It is not normal profit. There is literally no profit exists at all, because you have the minimum price being set. So you have running price already been set, because everybody knows everyone's price, reservations, etc. Therefore, nobody can actually have a higher price. If the moment you do that, then people will be running away from your kind of situation. You will be out, ousted out from the market, or nobody is going to buy anything from you. So this is why we had already the two ideal situation of monopoly, which is super profit situation, and of course in the perfect competition, which is this no profit situation in that sense. Now let me come to a little bit realistic kind of an market form, largely in 1930s, of course in the late 1920s, and of course early 1930s. Many people had a heated discussion in Britain and in the United States, and of course in all the academia where economics were largely and actively taught. So, of course, in many lectures, I used to tell that Mrs. Robbins, Joan Robinson, in fact, talked about imperfect competition, which is in fact the guiding principles of the market in 1930 itself. So, at the same time, in America, Edward Chamberlain, a professor at Harvard, in fact, tried to propose a situation, market situation, which is called the monopolistic competition. This monopolistic competition should not be actually, misunderstood as monopoly. And of course, it is completely different terminology in that sense. So, under the monopolistic competition, he characterized the following thing: like there are many sellers and buyers, just like a perfect competition. You can actually allow many buyers and seller. Each firm in the industry produces sellers slightly different product. That means, unlike the perfect competition, there is a product differentiation being introduced in this. Because in the real world, you, even if you are actually making similar kind of product, but they are not identical product. There is a kind of difference always exists in the real world. This is what is called the product differentiation, which is the very important characteristics which was brought out by or brought by Edward Chamberlain. And there is easy entry and exit as in the perfect competition. But given that product differentiation is allowed, there is a kind of information asymmetry is tried to crept inside this particular market situation, which is unlike the case of perfect competition. All right. So there are substitute for the firm's product, but not perfect substitute in that sense. So in perfect competition, you have a price which is equal to marginal cost, but in monopoly, your price is always greater than marginal cost. So this is a kind of realistic kind of situation, which was in fact brought out by again Edward, the Chamberlain, Mr. Chamberlain, Professor Chamberlain. So the monopolistic competitor price is always greater than the marginal revenue in that sense. So marginal revenue, therefore the price is actually since your price is greater than marginal cost, then your marginal revenue with in terms of price is actually have a positive relation. That is, you have always because the higher price, your revenue will be higher than your cost in that sense. So the monopolistic competitive output price is in fact going to be formed like just like I have provided in this graph. There is any standard textbooks has this thing. Anything, any book you take, you will get this graph for. So the monopolistic competitor produces that quantity of output for which marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. This is Q1 in the exhibit. Exhibit, it charges the highest price consistent with the quantity with the which the price is, or what you call, you have a demand which has been shown in a red line, and then you have marginal revenue which is in a yellow line. Then you have a marginal cost, naturally MC equals MA, where you fix the price, where your average total cost is also falling. At that position, you will get a super profit in that sense. So this is completely different from that of the earlier context, where your profit is not actually going to realize in that sense. Where this is actually completely a difference understanding. Will there be a profit in the long run? Of course, if the firm in the industry are earning profit, new firms will enter the industry and reduce the demand that each firm. Of course, the free entry and exist, because the free entry and exist, naturally there is going to be entry as well as there is going to be an exit. Okay, so in the long run, many people used to ask that whether there is a profit exists. Definitely, there is a profit exists. Why? Because the we said that even if it is long run, the differentiation of the product exists. Once you have difference of the product exists in the long run or short run, what makes it? The simple sense is that irrespective whether it is a short or long run or no run, what happens is that your profitability would be intact, because the perfect symmetry or the symmetry of information, perfect knowledge, etc., is in fact ruled out in this particular market situation. So once you have this particular market situation intact, allowing the information asymmetry, naturally you cannot simply say that this doesn't exist, the profitability doesn't exist, super profitability doesn't exist. So eventually competition will reduce economic profit to zero in the long run. Is in that sense is a sham. I don't really agree. But there are textbooks says that in the long run you will definitely have actually a kind of a zero profit in the long run. But I don't personally and logically understand or subscribe to this particular argument, because then what we are trying to say is that in the long run you allow a perfect information in that sense. Then a monopolistic competition can be reduced to as a short run phenomenon in that sense, and long run it become a perfect competition. But then the market situation boils down to a perfect competition, which is ideal in fact, but it is not real in that sense. So I do consider this perfect competition, so the monopolistic competition, and allow that the monopolistic competition will remain as in, irrespective of long or short term. Everything changes, but information also changes. But again, you can say that you will bring out new information asymmetry inside. So once you had this assumption of differential product, then there is no logic to say that you will be basically moving towards perfect competition or zero profit in the long run. So this is actually the apprehension which I do have when we discuss about the textbook market condition vis-a-vis the real world market situation in that sense. So monopolistic competition in the long run, because the easy entry into the industry, there are likely to be zero economic profit in the long run for the monopolistic competitor. In other words, P is equal to ATC in that sense. So this is, I don't basically agree with it, because then you try to show that there is no profitability in the long run. But otherwise, what in my mind, no, even if you carefully look into Chamberlain, then this discussion in fact makes no sense in the long run. But otherwise, it's okay. So to respond to this particular aspect, I would like to say that this the very idea of information asymmetry brought by Chamberlain inside the market condition itself gives a kind of a proof to the existence of profitability, or the rationale of existence of the profitability in that context. So when you, while trying to idealize economics, you try to basically bring this kind of a market situation into the stable of the perfect competition, which is quite unfair towards this particular theoretical formulation. And that is what I always feel. So, which is actually misleading also. So, again, if you come to the idea of perfect monopolistic competition, you also have to really deal with the excess capacity. What is it, and is it good or bad kind of a question in that sense. So excess capacity theorem in equilibrium, a monopolistic competitor will produce an output smaller than one that would minimize its unit cost. This is also a very rational kind of proposition, because no firm whatsoever is in fact in real world completely produce by utilizing its complete capacity. What is actually, unless you feel that actually you can entirely capture the market, you don't do it. Why? Because you will keep some sort of reservation in that. So this 1930 discussion is in fact brought a lot of realistic understanding or of the later development. So what I said, that while talking about this particular theoretical formulation or market condition, we cannot actually go back to the Bullock-Hart era, but what you are trying to advance economics from a point of the perfect competitive environment to the imperfect competitive situation, and you try to give a rationale that the excess capacity. Once you have excess capacity, other firms also know that there is an possible excess capacity for the rival firm. Once they have, then reducing the price by one firm is not actually going to happen. Why? Because they know that the other firm is also having excess capacity they can utilize. Then they can also bring down the price, and in that sense, none of them will basically get a better kind of price or profitability in that sense. So this is actually a kind of crux to understand this particular theoretical formulation. So if you are aware of all kinds of this possibility, then why should the firm is in fact going to do as the textbooks kind of formulation says, that in the long run it will be boils down to kind of a perfect competition and a zero profitability, which is kind of absolutely making it an ideal situation, and which is in fact crush the very principle of this particular formulation. Therefore, that is also we need to be carefully dealt with. The another point while coming to the monopolistic competition, the following, as we said, when monopolistic competitors earn zero economic profit, it is not producing the quantity of output at which average total cost are minimized for given scale of plant. Now, when monopolistic, zero economic profit. This concept of zero economic profit of that time maybe actually kind of uh, understanding where you want when you have what you call excess profit or enormous profit, do you feel that it's bad and all kind of situation? It's nothing like that, because then you don't call a monopoly and its existence, you cannot rationalize the monopoly. So it's okay to have this market situation. And in 50s and 60s, there was a lot of work which is in fact rationalized. And in later works in economics and all, people try to say that of course there is an information asymmetry, and that information asymmetry is in fact the motive behind, or sorry, the instrument behind the profitability in that context. Then why still textbooks try to whitewash this idea? In that sense, is again for me a kind of mirage. I would say that it's a bizarre kind of proposition. I don't say that it is actually hopeful, like a mirage. So, in long run equilibrium, the perfectly competitive firm produces the quantity of output at which unit costs are minimized. Again, once you have an excess capacity, it is there. That is about the short term. But in the long run, you keep expanding your firm also in that sense. If then you change everything, but doesn't mean that changing things is completely exhausting your excess capacity either. So again, there is a lot of conceptual clarification which is in fact required in this context, and that is why I'm readily responding that this is in that sense try to whitewash the idea for the sake of legitimizing the economic principles, and it's laying down a foundation in the perfect competitive environment. But that is not actually the kind of base in which the economic market in fact operate. So perfectly monopolistic competition for in my mind is one of the realistic kind of situation, and of course we shouldn't actually try to whitewash the conceptualization with the perfectly competitive uh, kind of situation, or what you call the assumptions and stuff like that. So now when you compare perfect competition and monopolistic competition, these are actually the kind of situation as we said earlier. In the perfect competition, the ATs, EMC and P is going to be one and the same in that sense. That is why you don't have a profitability. Neither, I mean, of course, indeed, you don't have a normal profit or super normal. There is no concept of profit exists at that point. So this is why your P is equal to AT is equal to MC. So, but that is not actually the case where your P curve, that is your demand, everything is horizontal in that sense, because nobody can change. Therefore, the downward sloping demand curve never exists under perfectly competitive situation. Where the downward sloping demand curve started to exist only under the monopolistic competition, or purely in the perfectly competitive, monopoly market situation. So either it is either it should be in monopoly, where as we have already seen that there is a perfect price discrimination. That means every individual is going to be paid differently in one or the other sense, in that sense. Okay, because of the product differentiation brought in, the horizontal uh, shape of the demand curve is going to be changed. That is actually the kind of change which Edward Chamberlain tried to articulate inside the economic scholarship. That is, the perfectly competitive firm produce a quantity of output consistent with the lowest unit cost. Monopolistic competition doesn't. If it did, it would either produce QMC, as I have given in this case, instead of QMC1, the monopolistic competitor is said to be underutilized its plant capacity, size, or have excess storage capacity. This is actually what we give or try to say that the profit margin of that firm in that sense. Other the firm is actually going to be pushed into the situation of a perfectly competitive environment where they make no profit at all. So it is perfectly logical to understand that this particular context in the comparative sense of monopolistic competition vis-a-vis perfectly competitive environment. Now, in the beginning, as I said, we more often textbooks try to get confuse people in that context. I don't completely, endorse this idea of what the characteristics of long run, which was given by textbook in that sense. So that's all about the monopolistic competition in that context. So let's look into the demand curve and advertising effect of monopolistic competition to substantiate what we had already talked about. So, in short run, the monopolistic competitor operates at excess capacity as a consequence of its downward sloping demand curve. Its downward sloping demand curve is a consequence of differentiated products in that sense. That is, firms sometimes use advertising to try to differentiate their products from their competitors' product. This is actually completely true in the real world situation. For example, we all try to use soap, shampoo, all kinds of cosmetics. You know that if you go to a supermarket, you will be encountering hundreds of different varieties of soaps. In different shapes, even in the same shop, brand name shop, soap, definitely having different flavors like different smell, different color, different that itself try to say that, and of course the prices also differs accordingly, though the brand name retained as one and the same in that context also. So this is actually the case with every commodity if you look into it. So then what is actually trying to say, this is perfectly an example of a perfectly monopolistic competition in that sense. That means the differentiation of the commodity itself gives legitimacy of the difference in price, and that difference in price naturally maybe give them profitability too. So so how they are doing it is basically with the help of the advertisement in that sense they try to give, and it wastes resources by promoting uh, contrived obsolescence. This is what is actually Galbraith tried to say. Of course, you try to create a kind of a situation or kind of a tendency among the consumers that through advertisement that this product is a great product. In 1950s or early 50s and 40s and 50s, cigarettes smoking advertisement ads are there, where very gender insensitive ads are given, that if you smoke some X brand, then you can put your woman under your boot. So kind of an advertisement. So the men are actually, though they are, the men wish to be patriarchal or try to be the men power centric kind of an attitude, then they will go and try to grab the cigarette and smoke. This is actually kind of creating an ego of this manhood, and a kind of this advertisement creates a sensibility in that sense. So men, so if you drink, if you smoke, then you become a man, and a non-smoker is actually not a man. So your manliness, in fact, in that sense, being basically created by this so-called advertisement in that sense. Same the case with if you drink with a glass of wine or rum or whiskey and all, then you become a symbol of manhood or kind of the power of the person with pride and so many kind of image the advertisement can in fact create. And definitely in the leher and Coca-Cola, all this kind of soft drinks and all, there are so many images in fact it creates, and that image in fact inculcates into the minds of the young boys and girls, of course. In the cosmetics and all, it has always been targeted the women, also men, by their masculine characteristics as well as feminine characteristics and stuff like that. So what is in fact this advertisement created is kind of a sense of reservation on certain commodity, that is I would prefer X commodity over Y commodity or Y commodity over X commodity, etc. So this is actually a kind of promotional contravened obsolescence. So this is what has actually been coined by Galbraith in that sense. So it distorts resources alone allocation in favor of private goods and away from public goods. So it also reverses the notion of consumer sovereignty in that sense. So now it is not because the consumer, though the consumer choose it, but at the same time, the very consumer is being uh, influenced by this advertisement in that sense. So now, so this is a kind of a situation you try to. Now, of course, this is true in every walks of life, at least in the last 100 years or less than 100 years or 50 years or more than 50 years of history always talks about. Because why I said this particular thing, this is because earlier what in the perfect competitive environment we said that there is nothing you can be. Now it is not like that, no, because of the images, because of the good effect or bad effect, or you can be exhibited as a good person or a bad person based on your choice, which is basically been influenced through this particular sort of an advertisement. In fact, gives a kind of reservation over that particular product, which, as I said, X or Y or Z, the person is prefers. It is not autonomous any longer. So the Galbraith argue that the business creates wants through advertisement. So as large corporations develop a new product, it plans and execute sort of advertising campaign to create a demand for the product. Demand then depends on output, which is called the dependency effect in that sense. So the implication of the revised sequence is the following: that the Galbraith then concludes that much of our product is wasteful. This is what is called the resource wastefulness, because you unnecessarily inculcate wants inside of people's mind and they will be acting accordingly, which is in fact creates a sense of waste, because they are not basically buying the commodity which they in fact want, but that want has been created. Therefore, even if they buy a commodity, they necessarily not utilizing the commodity at its optimal level. This is if it is not optimal level, then the buyers are in fact basically wasting that much of resources. This is a pretty logical argument which was been advanced by Professor Galbraith, and economists have criticized Galbraith theories. For example, Friedrich Hayek argued that the dependency effect is a non sequitur, that is does not follow, non sequitur kind of one. But it is not. Of course, I think obviously this is a possibility of production system, or the existence of production system, or what we can say that if you want to basically advance commodity production, you have to create wants because the demand should be created in that sense. So, the demand in that sense creates a kind of necessity, or a necessity can be created and make people to demand the commodity in that sense. So, this is actually drives a kind of situation in which your production will be advanced, otherwise it won't be. So there is equally, both had particular view, but I don't personally say that Hayek is right. Hayek of force right is only in the sense that in order to advance the capitalist kind of production, this is essential. Of course, that is what is can Galbraith, in fact, try to say also. What he said, in order to actually advance the capitalist production structure, they need to produce more and more. Then only they can get more and more profit out of selling the commodity. In that sense, in order to sell that commodity, they need to create a kind of a desire among people, and that desire, in fact, the driving force of demanding more and more. Whether they are optimally utilizing this is because this is no longer either of them trying to talk about a situation and no longer a closed situation which was addressed in the perfect competitive environment. So it is perfectly rational to talk about this particular market situation. And of course, both had their own point. Galbraith's point as well as Hayek's point is well taken in that sense. As a teacher, what I feel is that they have, of course, their own sufficiently substantiating logical argument in advancing the two dimensions of the same problem. Okay, and this is what is in fact I want to talk in terms of monopolistic competition. And now I think I have to move on to the other aspect, that is oligopoly situation, which is I will be taking as a separate lecture, not as a continuation, of course, as a continuation of the this lecture, but in a separate class. With this, let me conclude my lecture and thank you for watching this lecture.